everyone. Welcome to Textile Talks. I'm Amy Milne, Director of the Quilt Alliance, and I'm connecting from Morganton, North Carolina, in the foothills of our beautiful state. I think I see some North Carolinians who've just entered the chat. Thanks for being here. We have a fascinating and lively program, another one, 2 weeks in a row, to share with you today. So thanks for being here. Textile Talks is a weekly series, as many of you fans know, and it's presented on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern in partnership by the Quilt Alliance and our 3 partner organizations, SAQA, the Studio Art Quilt Associates, Surface Design Association, and the International Quilt Museum. All Textile Talks are recorded and available via YouTube. Thanks to our sponsors credited at the top of the hour and to donors like you, all Textile Talks are free. We'll put the link in the chat now for our donation page. Please consider making a donation today of any amount. We thank you in advance for your support. The Quilt Alliance mission is to document, preserve, and share the stories of all quilts and all quilt makers, and you can find our projects, events, and resources on our website at quiltalliance.org. Today, we're going to pass the mic to 2 guest presenters, 2 of our wonderful colleagues, Barbara Brackman and Merikay Waldvogel. They make up 1/3 of the group called the 6 Know-It-Alls, which is a group of 6 historians, curators, and dealers, quilt dealers, who offer virtual programs about quilts and textile history. And we'll be talking more about how you can take advantage of their programming. They have episode 24 available now, so they have really been busy, and it's a wonderful virtual program that you can take advantage of, thanks to the pandemic, essentially, which is what sort of got them going, but we'll get them to talk about that during our program. Just a quick reminder about the chat box. Please keep the chat box for greetings or comments or technical help, and let's reserve the Q&A box to enter your questions for our speakers. You can turn on live captions by clicking on the live transcript or CC button on your Zoom controls. And please note that I will be playing a video that's pre-recorded, so for a portion of our program, and I'll turn it to maximum volume, but you can still adjust the volume on your device as needed. Today's interview was recorded on March 14th, 2023. And after I play the video, we'll have time for questions. As I said, so please enter your questions at any time in the Q&A box as you listen. Okay, let's watch. I hope you enjoy it.
Hi, I'm Barbara Brackman, and welcome to Textile Talks. Today, my friend Merikay Waldvogel and I are going to bring you up to date on the 1933 Sears Quilt Contest at the World's Fair. It's about 90 years afterwards, but we are up to date. We have been studying this for a long time, and in fact, Merikay, I think that's how we met. We both were interested in this. I mean, we knew each other, but we both became crazy about this contest. So we have been studying it for quite a while. We're part of the 6 Know-It-Alls, and we want you to watch us. We do a once-a-month show with our 4 friends, and we started this during the pandemic when we were bored to tears, and we started getting together for a little discussion of quilts and some friendship, and we cracked ourselves up. So we thought we'd crack up the rest of the world. So do join us. And there's our Facebook page. You can just type in 6 Know-It-Alls. Sometimes there's 4 of us, sometimes there's 7. Well, we're going to talk, as I said, about this contest that Sears Roebuck and Company, the big department store, put on at the 1933 World's Fair. So I'll give you a little background. 1933 was the absolute depths of the Depression. In March, I believe, Franklin Roosevelt had to close the banks. So we've talking about bank closures lately, but all the banks in the United States were closed and people were completely broke. But Sears, being great at public relations, had a contest in which they offered $7,500 in prizes for quilts. They intended to put them in their building, which I have down here, a very modern building at the fair in Chicago. And they hired judges, and they had regional contests all over the United States. People heard about this, I think in February, as I recall. And the due date was May. So when we show you these quilts, you have to remember these people got the idea to do this in February and turned these in at their local Sears store just a couple months later. Of course, the motivation was an enormous amount of money. And the first prize could have won you $1,200. I never did look up what $1,200 would buy you in 1933, but a lot. So we have studied it through the people who entered, through the lives of the judges, and through the publications that Sears did. They did a lot of publications. And as I said, the public relations department was quite good. Here's a couple of guys in the mail order department looking at the entries. Now, let me move myself here so you can see. 25,000 quilts were entered. And they all came in those brown paper wrappers. These are, they're examining a quilt with a microscope or a magnifying glass. But they were overwhelmed, but they still carried it off because they were so organized. Their intent was to show a few quilts at the 1933 World's Fair, and they certainly had many to choose from. And as I say, you could win $1,000 for the first place. And here we say in the newspaper, Kentucky woman captures first prize. And that woman's name was Margaret Rogers Caden, and she won $1,000 for her quilt. So we got so fascinated with this, and this is before we had an internet. We had to drive around Kentucky at the time to talk to people and see if they knew Margaret Rogers Caden. And we published this book 20 years ago. So this is 20 years in which we're talking about a fair that was 90 years ago. The book is not in print, and we talk about redoing it. Yeah, right, Mary Kay. So here's the winner. We only have black and white pictures of it. The prize was to be awarded to the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and here she is being given it in the White House in 1933. And we spent a lot of time looking for this quilt, but we haven't found it yet. Mary Kay's going to talk a little bit more about our search. As I say, it's a black and white photo, but we know it's green because we have seen many copies, and it was described. It was certainly, it was a well done quilt. It was nicely done, nicely sewed, but very, very unmodern, except that it was green, and that what we call 30s green or kitchen green was very, very innovative at the time. It was a new dye that was quite color fast, and it sort of defined the 30s and 40s, maybe even the 50s, as you may recall if you lived through it. Kitchen green. But it really influenced the look of the pastels in quilts, we think. And we do think that this contest really did have an influence on the whole look of that time period afterwards. So as I said, we have only these black and white pictures, and some of them are darn fuzzy, but we do have copies, and I'll explain to you about the copies in a few minutes. So we know it kind of looks like this, with those shades of green, probably a couple of shades of solid, and then a print in the star. It's a very common pattern, and it's hard to do if you want to try and get all those seams to go in the center. But the thing that was impressive about it was not the piecing, was the quilting. And I'll go back here. The quilt, you can see fuzzy detail of it, and I've got better pictures in a couple minutes. But the whole quilt was so much a Kentucky quilt that at first we just thought, well, here's a star quilt with some impressive stuff work. But over the years, we've realized that this quilt was part of the Kentucky quilt tradition. And there are many, many quilts that are sort of the parents of that particular World's Fair winning quilt. These are two that are extraordinary. They're silk, and that seems to have been a Kentucky tradition, whereas people in other places used a lot of calicos. Kentuckians, especially around Lexington and Louisville, used a lot of silk in their quilts. And obviously, this stuffed work idea was very important. Now, these two quilts, one's in the Met, the one on the left, and one's in the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian. Both of these are attributed to a couple of sisters, Morton sisters, they were named, who were slaves at a big plantation near Russellville, Kentucky. These quilts these date from before the end of slavery, when these women were seamstresses at a plantation for the Morton family, which is where they got their names. Now, here's a caption down here telling us a little bit about them. It tells us that their religious sentiments were obvious. I don't know how you can tell a person's religious sentiments from a star quilt, but I certainly can tell that their Kentucky heritage was important. These nice shades, some more. Oh, this is a drawing of the winner that was in Capper's Weekly. You can buy the pattern, and it shows very much accurately the kind of a fern, a leaf that was the stuffed work, and then those leaves in the border that sort of line up on a little parade. Oh, did I go backwards? I think I went backwards. Now, the reason we have so many copies is that Mountain Mist sold the pattern after the fair. They called it Star of the Bluegrass, which I think is what Margaret Rogers Caden called it, named it after her state, Kentucky. But many, many quilts were made from this pattern, and it gave you the stuffed work, showed you how to do it. The one on the bed is interesting, and I point this out just because it's got cut out corners, and I've never seen this quilt. Usually the copies, that was kind of an old-fashioned idea for a four-poster bed, but that one, Mountain Mist model, has cut out corners. Well, another reason there are so many copies is that the Cadence Sisters, Margaret had a sister named Anne. They ran a needlework shop in Lexington. Lexington. And they sold kits after the fair. So Merikay is lucky enough to have that kit on the left. She could make one of these quilts because all the stuffed work's been done for her. And the stars are all there too, although I'm not wanting to put in those corners. You can see up at the top here. I'm not wanting to put those corners in a star somebody else made. But here is the way to make a copy. And that's one reason we've had so much trouble finding the original, is we keep getting sidetracked by copies. So the stuffed work is definitely a Kentucky tradition. And I think this quilt grew out of that tradition. I think the maker was very aware of a star of the bluegrass being reflective of her state. The star itself, now that seems real common to us because we use it a lot today, and people have, but I've been really impressed by the fact that it's quite common in Kentucky. The stuffed work, again, is something that is not common. And Merikay has found a lot of evidence of stuffed work in Tennessee, and we have it here in Kentucky. This is another quilt from that Morton plantation near Russellville. And this one is in the American Museum of Folk Art, attributed to the plantation mistress, Mrs. Morton. I doubt it. But I think it's, I think it's all a shared craft where these seamstresses might do the quilting and the mistress of the house might do the piecing, or the seamstresses did everything. Do notice though down here this kind of fern frond, which is what we see in the wedding quilt. Now it's to the point now when I see a silk star quilt, stuffed or not, I think that's a Kentucky quilt. So I did a little work on this woman, Laura Eyestone. Fortunately, she has an odd name, so she was pretty easy to trace. She was a school teacher in Normal, Illinois, one of my favorite place names, Normal. And there's a little schoolhouse there that's a museum that's dedicated to her because she was quite influential. So she was born in Illinois, and they have this quilt at Illinois State University where the little schoolhouse is. And they say that Laura made it in Illinois. And I look at that and I go, first of all, Laura, I think she's a little young to have made that. And I just think it looks like a Kentucky quilt. So I did a little work and I found that Laura was adopted. And her adoptive mother was born and died in Kentucky. So I think this was a family quilt that Laura inherited. And, you know, when it went to the museum, it family was, oh, Laura made this in Illinois. But it's in terribly, you know, worn shape because silk is rather fragile. And it doesn't have the stuffed work, but it certainly has that silk star look that was so Kentucky. Another thing that I've looked at since we wrote the book, I really did not understand, and neither did Merikay, when we drove around Kentucky and talked to people. We did not understand about women making quilts for money. We just assumed, as the romance of the patchwork quilt will tell us, if you've got a quilt from your grandma made it. Well, it never occurred to me until we started working on this. If you've got a quilt that your grandma laid or sent down to you, she might very well have bought it from a woman who made quilts for a living. So I've done a whole lot of work on this in the past couple of years, and it's really changed my thinking. Quilt making was a way to make money for people who did not have husbands to support them for various reasons, or were single, or were just falling on hard times. And there, of course, there are always people who love making quilts, and so they got a double enjoyment by not only selling them but enjoying their work. So I've looked at this quite a bit over the past couple of years and found that there are so many records of people, especially during the Depression, selling quilts for money as a living. And here's a nice picture down at the bottom of some people with a roadside stand, mother and 3 daughters. And I would guess they all worked on those quilts and sold them. There's a magazine article up there in 1936, a woman who's made 500 quilts, she says, and she sells them. And she says, I didn't put the whole article, but she says she mostly just sells the tops. And then she says people can finish them up like they want to. So that would be the fun part, would just be getting the ideas and making the tops and maybe standing out there on the highway and selling a few of them. But I do want to point out on the left, in the Kansas City Star in 1930, I looked through the want ads and look how many people are selling quilts. This is just not something I would have thought. And I think it's certainly a function of the Depression, which was just starting, but also a function of the fact that quilts were really becoming a real fashion. So I've been looking around for people who won the contest, who were professional quilt makers. And we certainly found out that Margaret Rogers Caden was a professional quilt maker, and her sister was ran a needlework store. Now here we have another woman who did this beautiful quilt in cotton sateens, called it Louisiana Rose. It's somewhat of an original design, original variation, certainly. She lived in Louisiana, and we have always admired this quilt. We actually had this quilt to show, I think. But I found a little reference to her in the Quilt Index, in that wonderful Quilt Index, where this particular quilt belonged to someone from Louisiana, but she had bought it, she said, from Mrs. Hyde of Crowley, and that must be her, Celia. Here's a picture of her in her older age. She was an artiste, a painter, and she was probably quite talented. And it said in the Quilt Index file that she was an early widow and made quilts as a way to add income, and the family bought this in 1936 after the fair. Just think how winning a big prize, as Celia did, would affect your business. her husband really did not die until later, I think 37, but he was ill and he could not support them. So I think she turned to quilt making. And she probably looked at that contest entry form and thought about it. And she said, if I can win, I'm sure I'll get work and I'm sure my quilts will be worth more money. I hope she got some money from Sears, who published her pattern in their booklet of the Century of Progress. And they also apparently made kits. And this one's in the Kentucky Historical Society. So you bought a little box made exclusively for Sears. And each box, I think, had enough for one block. I certainly would hope that Sears paid her a royalty or bought it from her outright. You know, we don't know much about the women's work at the time. But it's been real fascinating to keep following it up and going back with different threads. And Merikay is going to tell you some of the gossip. So thanks a lot. And Merikay, you got stuff to say? You know, we've been working on this for so long.
Another interesting thing about the Kentucky people is that of the top 30 quilts that were judged, I think 5 of them were from Kentucky. I think there was definitely some kind of challenge, some competition going on between people in Kentucky. And they figured out ways to enter the contest and still win. I think they may have, you know, Mrs. Combs, Mrs. Leitzel, Kentucky, it was in the water there, things going on.
Instead of competing in Louisville,
right,
they kind of spread it around, because every Sears store, every big Sears store, had a regional contest with judges. That's clever. Well, you know, our dear friend Cuesta, who was our mentor, always said to us, Kentucky quilts, they're the best. And they had a reputation and they had to keep it up, but they deserved that reputation.
Yeah.
They made fantastic quilts.
Yeah, Barbara was right that I think we did know each other. I met her in the 80s in Chattanooga. I was just enthralled with the way she organized the piece patterns, and she'd already written an article for Uncoverings about contests, not just this contest, but quilt contests. And when I wrote Soft Covers for Hard Times in 1990, I decided, well, I'm just going to focus on how the contest played out in the South, in the Southeast. And then when that book was published, Barbara said, well, why don't the two of us do a quilt book together? And that was where it's become, Barbara, it's 30 years since we published this book. Anyway, it's been a lot of fun. And when we did publish the book in 1993, we had found 95 quilts that we looked into pretty deeply and documented and photographed. But we felt like we had enough to tell the story. We chose 30 of those 95 quilts for the book, had them photographed, and we also traveled those 30 around the country for about 2 or 3 years. And of course, then we heard more stories and more stories. And I think by now we have something like close to 300 stories. And as she said, she began looking in Chicago when she was living there. And she told me that she had found this one page from the catalog. And on it, it had the names of the regional winners, the top 3 in the 10 regions. And she actually wrote a letter to the newspapers and got some responses, and some of the best stories came out in that first wave. But now we do it a lot differently, and we did it somewhat differently in the 90s, but we still didn't have access to what we have today. She also found these, when she went to the Sears headquarters in Chicago and met with the archivist there, a woman named Vicki Swoke. And they didn't have a lot of things, but they did have some publicity photos. And these photos have become kind of the touchstones. And we felt like there was enough information right here to go ahead with the book. And you've seen some of these already. One of our goals was to try to add color to these pictures. This one in the bottom right turned out to be a really important photo. At the time, again, we didn't know that these were the top prize winning quilts. And we now have found most of these quilts. We still have not found this one in the bottom right. This is probably a red and green quilt that was from Minneapolis that you still see there in black and white. And I'm sure a lot of you recognize the one right in front, one of our favorites, and one that Barbara actually got a response from in the first wave of letters. The family still owns this quilt. It was entered by a woman named Edith Matthews. Now I know she was born in 1885. I remember we thought she was such a young girl standing here in front of her quilt, but really she was, I think 48 years old. And her husband was a plant engineer, a power plant engineer, and he was injured, home, unemployed, depths of the Depression. And he looked at his wife and said, why don't you enter this contest? They read about it. And so he suggested they take some of the images that were coming out about the fair. And she called this originally, this quilt she designed. It was not her first quilt, as it turns out. It was the first time she entered a quilt contest. And she called it originally Spinning Comets, but in the end it was named The Spectrum. And it won in the Western region and won first place. The judges in Los Angeles did indeed seem to favor some of the modern quilts. The grand prize winning quilt, you've heard, we've talked about it, and we had heard that Miss Caden did not make the quilt. Now, I live in Tennessee, Kentucky's not far, and the folklorist in Kentucky is the one who first told me, he said, you know, I'd asked him to write the introduction to Soft Covers for Hard Times. And he said, you know, I've heard that Miss Caden didn't make the quilt. Is that right? And I said, maybe. And he said, and then we went up there, we began to hear the story again and again. And we actually did go from Knoxville up to Lexington, Kentucky. And we went to visit some of these, the women, not the women themselves who worked on the quilts, but their nieces, their grandchildren, etc. In this case, Ellen Manus, seen here on the left, her niece, Ida Rohr was her name, shared with us some black and white pictures of Miss Ellen Manus. And the story was that she was one of those professional quilt makers. Quilt tops would come to her and she would parcel them out to people in her county, Owsley County in Eastern Kentucky. And then she'd bring them back and she would send them. She served as kind of the focus of the network. In fact, she had worked quite a few years for Miss Caden, and on this particular project, the project order came to her and with the fabric, I assume, and she sent it out to various people. So we went to interview. Every time we went to a house, they said, oh, you should go down and see so-and-so. We went to one house and this is what they showed us. These pieces that were saved by Maddie Black's family. They were pieces from the border. And you could see how the tropanto, or this, I really called it more padding. They put a piece of white cloth on the back of the border. And so you could work on it by the piece and then put all those borders together once they were, the tropanto was done. You could also see that the drawing of the leaves is on the back, on the white. So the work was done from the back. So anyway, the whole quilt was put together and sent off to Chicago. Now, isn't that an interesting place that Miss Caden sent? She sent her quilt directly to Chicago, knowing probably that if she had sent it to Memphis or even Atlanta, somebody might have known that she didn't really know one end of the needle from the other. In fact, she was good at organizing. And remember, she was working with her sister, A.M. Caden. So another aspect of this that we haven't really talked about yet is that Sears was really looking for a quilt that would be an original design that commemorated the Century of Progress exposition. And they were going to offer $200 on top of the grand prize of $1,000. A lot of people took that challenge. We know that because those are the quilts that show up. They're very distinctive. They're pictorial usually. They usually will have the dates on them. A lot of the imagery from the World's Fair shows up on these quilts, like the dates, 1833 to 1933. The fair itself was commemorating the 100th anniversary of Chicago. This spinning ball that you see on the logo in the upper left represented Arcturus star, the light from Arcturus star, which was 40 years away. They were going to harness those light beams, and the idea was that there had been a World's Fair in 1893, the Great White City. The light beams come, and that was in 1893, 40 years earlier. So the light coming from Arcturus would be the light that had started 40 years old. It was kind of a publicity stunt, but it turned out to be a big deal. Every night they would harness this light and set all the lights ablaze on the World's Fair site. They called it the Rainbow City, and with Crayola colors, primary colors. It was really quite a sight. And in the bottom right is the Sears building. Now, if Sears is sponsoring the contest, it would be a good idea to put it on there on your quilt. And here are some examples. Every single one of these commemorative quilts has the Sears building on it, right in the center or at the bottom, or little tiny one over there on the far right with upper right, the bird's eye view of the World's Fair site. And the one on the bottom right, it has the Sears pavilion in the center also. But that husband and wife team focused on changes in the 100 years, the Century of Progress. This letter had floated around in the quilt world from a woman named Ida Stowe. Nobody knew what she looked like until after the book came out. But let's just pretend we don't see her picture there, but I like to think that she's there. June 6th, right as the judging is going on in Chicago, she is complaining, and she actually wrote a letter to the Sears people and to complain that these commemorative quilts were not being judged fairly. And she was asking that the entire group of them be put in the final collection of awards and judged again by the judges named in the brochure. Well, they didn't, that's a lot to ask, but as it turns out, in 1934, when the World's Fair was repeated that summer in 1934, Sears did not have a contest. They didn't have quilts to show. So Sue Roberts, the contest organizer, wrote to people in the Chicago area who had made commemorative quilts, and she hung them in the exposition hall. And right in the center, in the back, unbeknownst to us, is a quilt by Ida Stowe. So she got the center attention. And it's interesting to see where she got her design. And I'd like to point out too that every quilt that was entered had a tag on the bottom right that every entrant had to attach. Hers was still attached when it was found while the quilts were on display. In about 1995, it was found in California. And I said to the people who contacted us, how do you know it's the Ida Stowe quilt? And they said, well, the tag is attached on the bottom right. And I asked them to describe it. And I thought, oh my gosh, could it be the quilt in the back of that photo? So it turned out it was. And Robert and artist, they were selling the quilt. Robert and artist James, I contacted them and they said, I said, wouldn't you like to purchase this and maybe donate it to the International Quilt Museum? They did. And so you could see this on their catalog, their online catalog. It's interesting to read here what every entrant signed. About 2/3 of the way down, it says, I certify that this quilt is entirely of my own making and that it's never been exhibited before. A lot of people signed that and didn't think twice about it. Here's a close-up of it. They found the black and white photo came along with the quilt. So it's really a beautiful quilt. It's kind of a steel gray crepe, and it's quite fragile. But she is the one who complained, and she did get some results. And in fact, these are the quilts that we treasure today. Where is the grand prize winning quilt? We really have no idea. Both Barbara and I searched as administrations changed. We'd contact the White House. The Roosevelt houses have been contacted many times. There is a letter that as at the Roosevelt Library that's pretty interesting, a very short letter. Margaret typed a letter to Mrs. Roosevelt and asked that Mrs. Roosevelt send her a letter to acknowledge the fact that she'd gotten the quilt. The response, there's a carbon copy, and it's not, Miss Caden wanted it signed by the new First Lady. It's not signed by Eleanor Roosevelt, the carbon copy. It's signed by the secretary to Eleanor. I really think Eleanor knew what was going on in Kentucky, and she wasn't ready to give that kind of credit to Miss Caden. But nevertheless, we know that Miss Caden went on, and her sister A.M. Caden went on and made kits, and they were able to publicize the fact that the grand prize winning quilt did come through their store. So 280 quilts so far have been found and documented. Check the Quilt Index for photos and stories. Amy's going to put a link up in the chat. Also, several of these quilts have ended up in the Illinois State Museum and the International Quilt Museum, and you're encouraged to look there. But really, the Quilt Index is a great resource. They were able to give us a lot of space to put lots of the quilts up there. We have a list of all the quilts that have been found and the stories. It's very easy to go to, and I want to encourage you to go there. So Barbara, what do you think? I'm going to stop sharing. And
well, it's pretty, it's such a fascinating story. And I want to talk a little bit more about how we searched for the Roosevelt quilt. Franklin Roosevelt died suddenly in his, I think, 4th term. And Eleanor had to get out because of the Truman family. It's a terrible thing. The Truman family wanted to move in. So what we have found is that she gave many things that had been given to her away to her help, to the servants, to her secretaries, to her friends. And we would guess that this quilt, which I don't think meant a lot to Eleanor,
right,
was just given to someone who said, oh, this is very nice, and then used it up, with nothing attached to it. But we have talked, we've talked to the Roosevelt family, and no one ever remembered it. So 20 years, 30 years, what the heck, Merikay? I can't add anyway. I'd prefer not to know. So we have, we occasionally come. across a quilt that looks just like it for sale, and we get all excited, and then we find it's not this. So I don't think we'll ever find it.
She did make a duplicate.
Yes, Miss Caden did, or she didn't make it.
Right. She had one made and it was given to her niece, I think. And that it's very close. We actually showed that one. We added it to the exhibit in Lexington, Kentucky. And I remember when we did that, I thought, oh boy, we are really, fear and trepidation. I wondered, what are the Kentucky people going to say when that exhibit is up? But I remember the newspaper reporter there she said, oh, we all knew this story. Don't worry about that. She said, we're just still kind of interested in the Cadence Sisters. They had really quite a successful operation there. I also say that Sears missed an opportunity, or maybe their judges that they showed missed an opportunity to really focus on original designs, because I think we could show that there was some really amazing work done. Each one of those quilts was a double size. I mean, those were full size quilts made in about 3 months. We know that they were made then because of when the contest opened and closed. The Celia Hyde quilt that you showed earlier, there's a 1932 date on there.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
And I think she made that earlier and just entered it. They weren't supposed to be doing that. They didn't want antique quilts. They wanted new things. But anyway, we are still looking for quilts. If people want to send us stories, we're anxious to share them, and they do still come through. It's really quite surprising.
And most of them are very recognizable. Well,
Right.
we've always thought the problem was that the people at Sears in the publicity department, Sue Roberts and other people, decided that they would love to have a quilt that reflected the building, if nothing else. Couldn't hurt that building in there. But they never communicated that to the judges. Or if they did, the judges, and we know well who the judges are, the major final judges, and or Mary McElwain, were both professional quilt makers. There was a woman from the Art Institute of Chicago, and then Sue herself was the judge. And I'm surprised Sue did not push more for saying, we've advertised that we'll give you another $200 if it reflects the fair. And up to, it's Ida Stowe's complaint. They just ignored that because many of the quilts that won some money, and there'd be hundreds rather than up there in the thousand, but many of them were very traditional. Although they look, I think we can't see it through their eyes because they were pastels. Pastel was new. They just about 1930, 31, 32, the dye companies started being able to produce the colors that are in the quilt behind Merikay, solids that did not fade. You could have a solid pink in 1890, but it would just disappear. So by 1930, it was a whole new game in the dye industry, and people really responded to that. So we think this contest did have some influence. I don't know what would have happened if Ida Stowe's quilt would have won. Would we have would we have had an art quilt phenomenon in the 30s? I don't know, but Ann Orr certainly wasn't going to. And then there's the corruption idea. Ann Orr gave a prize to a quilt that she designed. Now, I know you're not supposed to do that. So not only, there's just rules that we follow today that were not important to them, apparently. But it has been so much fun because there's always a scandal. And there's always another quilt. We've got like 24,000 some to go. So don't trust me with numbers.
And you had an idea of maybe doing a know-it-alls segment on
we should
on contests or fairs, because it really is an interesting subject to to get into, and quilts often figure in these fairs. So
Well, in our own lives, we're the same age, but I remember when Ginny Barrett changed the way quilts looked by winning a prize.
mhm.
And remember the time that Carol Breyer Fowler entered and won at Athens at the Quilt National with a machine quilted.
Mhm.
It was a scandal. People stood in front of it
Mhm.
just tutting. They
Mhm.
were so furious about it. So, and then all of a sudden, that was what you did.
Mhm.
So the contests are very interesting in their influence.
Yeah, they serve as kind of a gateway, especially this one, especially, I think, because things really did change before and after it. And I think it does represent a lot of technological changes too. But, look at all the patterns that came out and all the books that came out afterwards, the newspaper columns with quilts in them, the kits. I mean, it set off, or it set forth a quilt revival big time through the 30s, even despite the Great Depression, maybe because of the Great Depression. It was a way to, kind of like the pandemic, bring back something, an old tradition, and make it new. So,
And something to do at home
yeah.
when you couldn't afford to go out.
Mhm.
Sound familiar? Oh, that was fantastic. I'm going to invite Merikay and Barbara to come back on and join me. I'm going to show real quick a little contact information for them, and then I'll turn my slide sharing off. But just I've just pasted this in the chat as well, so that you can find them, and the 6 know-it-alls, you can find them on their website here via Facebook and the Facebook group. And this is the current episode available now, and that's where you can find it. I just put that in the chat as well. Don't miss it, folks. All right. Well, there's only 25 questions in the Q&A box. Bringing the drama. Merikay and Barbara bringing the quilt drama. It's such a fascinating story. What question do you want to start with?
Noticed one. Someone suggested we look at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Oh, don't think we haven't. We've spent a good deal of time on that one too. So, don't get us started on Chicago and World's Fair. We both lived in Chicago when we were young, so that's one reason for our interest. But we have done work on that, and maybe you'll invite us back sometime.
Yes, and I think a KIA episode on this topic would be well received. I think people would love to hear more. I would love to hear more.
Well, we've discussed it, and there may have been like 500 quilts at that 1893 fair. I don't know, I'm just pulling a number out of the hat.
Yeah.
10,000 are passed down with information that they were shown there. I mean, there's a lot, we can't find evidence of many of them, but it was, the era of the crazy quilt, and there are some spectacular pictorial things going on there. We don't like it as much as we like 30. We're going to get the time machine. We're not going back to 93. We're going to 33.
What are the questions? Merikay, what are you gravitating towards on this list?
Second. Well, I was, I'm frozen. One of the questions that often we get is that the quilt was shown. I have a family quilt. It was shown at the Chicago World's Fair. And is there a list of names? And there really wasn't a register of all 24,000 names, but there were lists, mimeographed, typed up lists, typed up and mimeographed and sent back to the winners of they were the regional winners. So we have those lists for the top 10 regions. So we have about 100 names and their towns. But For the World's Fair in 1893, there are stories that quilts were displayed, but there was never really a contest. And even the women's building that was so famous in 1893 didn't seem to be showing quilts. So it's a mystery. We would like to know more if there's a smoking gun out there, if somebody's got a letter or something from the 1893 fair. It would be a great piece of quilt history.
Well, each state had who wanted to cooperate and pay the money, had a building in 1893 at the fair. And I think that's where most of the quilts were shown. Here's our best stuff from Iowa. We got corn, beautiful, corn displays with the words Iowa spelled out in corn, but quilts too. So I think that has been our best source for finding what was actually shown.
Have we answered the question about stuffed or tropanto?
No, answer that. Yeah.
Well, what do you want to talk about it, Barbara?
What you want to know, how to do it?
Just the difference between the two terms.
Doing stuff work? Just terms. Tropanto is an Italian word for sausage. When I was living in Chicago, I taught quilting. I had an Italian student. She said, "Why do you call this sausage?" He said, "Well," she said, "I just don't think that's the proper word," but she was Italian. So I'm continuing to call it stuff work. And it's just textile terms change over time. And even when they're current, whoever you are working for or representing uses a different term.
But
So
we really think that is what caught the eyes. That was another question I think I saw.
Yeah.
What
Why?
was it about the winner?
Yeah.
I think it was the stuffed work.
nobody was doing that in 1933. It was so old-fashioned, except, in Kentucky and Tennessee.
Well, it wasn't going on in Tennessee in 1933 at all, but no, she revived it and added it, and it could have come like Barbara's found. It could have been a Kentucky tradition with silk quilts from the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people, I remember the story about Bertha Stange, and she entered one of those commemorative quilts.
Mm-hmm.
She became the most prize-winning quilter in the 20th century, but she didn't win that 1933 fair. It was her first one. Well, she had entered others, but she didn't win that one. And she said she went to see what the judges liked, and she saw that tropanto, and she started adding that to her quilts from then on. And she began winning quilts up through the 40s. So I think, yeah.
Well, I taught tropanto when I was younger, and it's hard to teach because you are taking cotton, which is pretty stiff now, and pulling it up, and what you get is wrinkles. So your block is no longer square. So people were very disappointed in what happened after they pulled it up. But I think cotton used to be more elastic. Now, there was someone in the 70s who decided you could do it with polyester double knit, but don't. So I think Rose Kretzinger, who was our famous Kansas Quilter Prize winner, she did a lot of stuff work quilt, or I think she actually did it, and then she sent the quilt to her quilters because I think she was impressed by what was winning, and she loved to win.
Somebody asked about that Spectrum quilt, Edith. Yeah. It is still owned by the family, and it's a great grandchild, I think, or great grandniece, and they donated it to. They didn't donate it. They were not willing. They lent the quilt to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and it was on exhibit there last summer at that wonderful exhibit. But it was not included in the catalog, I think, because the museum doesn't own the quilt. And then when the exhibit was determined that the exhibit would travel to Los Angeles, the quilt went with it. Not all the quilts from that exhibit went, but Spectrum went. I think it became a real people's favorite from that exhibit, and it is still owned by the family. I don't have their name in front of me, but they're in Oregon, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I am just typing. If we don't get to your question, which we really are running out of time, join the Know It Alls Facebook group. It's a great place to
Oh,
talk about quilts, ask questions. What were you going to say, Mary Kay?
we were going to talk real quick about the Quilt Index. There's a
Yes, go for it.
opportunity on the Quilt Index to upload your information about your own quilt.
Exactly.
And we've got the link. It's a brand new, I looked at it today and just tried it out, and it's an interactive form that is very easy to do. And you could even you could do as much as you want on it and add it to the 90,000 quilts that are currently in the Quilt Index. And the Quilt Index is a good place to find all kinds of things. There are lots of secret, unknown quilts in there. Barbara has found several in recent editions that were not in our book that are on the Quilt Index about the Sears Quilt Contest too.
They have, a comment in the words 1933 across them.
Yeah, it's hard to tell if just a plain ordinary Lone Star quilt was entered, but there certainly were quite a few of those.
Yes, because people and the judges responded to that. They wanted nice, traditional, well-done patterns. Well, I looked up yesterday what $1,200 was worth in 1933. I knew it was a lot. You could buy 2 Ford sedans for $450 each, and then
Wow.
100, and you could take family and cousins on a road trip to Chicago and probably stay at the Palmer House. I mean, it was a ton of money. And I don't know what Margaret Rogers Caden did with her 1,000, but we're still kind of down on her.
Unbelievable. Well, Barbara, Mary Kay, thank you so much. This has personally been so much fun and so great to have you all, have you both, and have a chance to see what the know-it-alls are all about. And again, I'll can't say enough about this series. You can look through the chat here to find the page to register. The most recent talk is now available, and you can watch it at any time after you register. I just want to plug next week's talk, which is presented by Surface Design Association, Future Tense 2023 SDA Student Exhibition with juror Natalie Baxter. It sounds really great. Also, I just want to thank all our sponsors. And Lucy's going to show you our video again, but thank you everyone for being here. Really appreciate your supporting and being a part of Textile Talks.